Class 7 of the Human Rights course is on sex and gender diversity. It is a discussion between Professor Douglas Sanders, an academic associate of Mahidol's Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies, and Joel Mark Barredo, an MA graduate in Human Rights from Mahidol University.
Hi, I'm Joel Barredo from the Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Mahidol University. This is the class on sex and gender diversity. I will have a discussion with Professor Douglas Sanders.
Hello, I'm Professor Douglas Sanders. I'm a retired law professor from the University of British Columbia in Western Canada, and I'm an academic associate at the Institute for Human Rights and Peace Studies, Mahidol University.
Professor, can you define some terms being used in sexuality discussions?
Yes, because there's been some confusion and controversy and uncertainty about the use of particular terms. Sex, technically used, refers to physical sex or biological sex. Gender refers to socially constructed patterns of behavior. How you speak, how you dress, various presentations of self which are seen as feminine or masculine or androgynous in the particular society. But to confuse things, sex is often used to mean gender and gender is often used to mean sex. So you have to think carefully about what is being said. Sexual orientation refers to the physical attraction that an individual feels to others on the basis of their sexual characteristics, their physically sexual characteristic. Maybe it's influenced by gender expression as well. The term gender identity is used to refer to the sense that the individual has of being masculine or feminine or androgynous. It may be in contrast to the physical sex, or as it's often put, the sex assigned or identified at birth. So you have a birth certificate and there's only two boxes. You're either M or F. But maybe your sense of yourself as a sexual person is not correctly identified on the birth certificate. Transgender is a broad umbrella term for wanting to express yourself, or in fact expressing yourself, in ways that are not wholly masculine if you're a man physically, or feminine if you're a woman physically. So it can involve simple mannerisms. Not all of us are 100% masculine. It may be minor. It may involve cross-dressing. It may involve a wish to physically change your body to bring it into line with your sense of gender identity. Intersexual has been added to this grouping of terms only in the last about 5 years. And it is really quite different. It refers to a physical body which is not entirely male or female, or sometimes it's put that it combines elements of male and female. There are a number of specific conditions in which the body is not simply male or simply female. Of course, there's tremendous overlap between the physical male body and the physical female body, which means that sex reassignment surgery is possible because when we're first in the womb, we are undifferentiated in terms of male and female. It's only after a couple of months that some hormones rush in and there's a determination as to whether the fetus is going to emerge with mostly male characteristics or mostly female characteristics. So you can see that there's a range of categories that we now talk about in terms of sexuality issues and sexuality rights. And what brings these different groupings together, in spite of the differences in reality for these groups, is the sense of unease or discrimination or hostility on the part of the larger society to these variations in sex and gender. So we often talk about LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersexual as a short form for an acronym for this range of sexuality category. Some people are unhappy about the idea that, oh, this sounds like it's discrete categories, you're in one or another. And when indeed, these are all spectrums. Our behavior is more or less masculine, more or less feminine. Our sexual attraction can be more or less homosexual or heterosexual. And so having something as neat and orderly as LGBTI sort of suggests a rigidity. And so people want to talk about SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And this is more universal language because everybody has a sexual orientation. Everybody has a gender identity. Everybody has gender expression. And so you're not creating boxes, you're creating sort of subjects that you talk about. At the UN, the terminology which sort of broke through when we first started making progress was LGBT, and then I got added. Now increasingly at the UN, it really is SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, with another I added on the end to emphasize the inclusion of intersexual.
Let's review these key terms. In everyday language, sex and gender can mean the same thing. Though technically, sex refers to the biological features, making someone male or female, and gender is a social role which a person is expected to take on in society. Gender is socially contracted, as different societies have different gender roles. Sexual orientation refers to the sexual attraction felt by an individual towards another on the basis of the other's physical sex. Gender identity is the sense someone has of their gender, which is sometimes related to their sex, but in some cases is not. Transgender is an umbrella term for expressing oneself outside of the social norms of either male or female. Intersexual is someone whose physical body may be either male or female. LGBTI stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersexual. SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. It is used to refer to a group of related but distinct issues facing the LGBT community.
And it's very, very important to know. And I'm particularly interested in the context of Southeast Asia and sexuality at that. And I'm very curious about the presence of anti-homosexual criminal laws in Southeast Asia. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes. Criminal prohibitions of homosexual acts in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general only exist in former British colonies. At one point, all of the colonial powers in Europe prohibitions of same-sex acts, usually limited to male acts. These trace back through Christian church law, to Roman law, to early Christianity, to Jewish rules in the Old Testament. In the 19th century, and so these existed everywhere in Europe. Mm-hmm. In the 19th century, though, under a French lead, half of the countries in Europe, without actually explaining why, dropped this from the new penal codes that were based on the Napoleonic penal code. So boom, suddenly overnight, not overnight, it took about 60 years, we found that these criminal prohibitions disappeared from France, from the Netherlands, from Spain, from half of Europe, but not from Britain. Britain retained a religiously based anti-homosexual, anti-sodomy law applying to males. Also, it included anal intercourse, heterosexual anal intercourse, and bestiality with animals was thrown into the same section. So, and it had the death penalty. The death penalty was part of that prohibition in British law up until 1860. In the 20th century, fast forward, in the 20th century, All of Europe junks these laws. The half that didn't come under the Napoleonic Penal Code gets rid of them. And you get a decriminalization occurring in North America, Canada, the United States, and Australia, and New Zealand. So there is a big change which occurs. And in the 1990s, Russia and Eastern Europe states that had been part of the Soviet Union, they decriminalize as well. But Britain had exported its prohibition to its huge empire, and so half the world had a prohibition. But boom, Britain decriminalizes, Europe completely decriminalizes, Latin America is decriminalized. And so in Southeast Asia, what do we have? We have Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and Myanmar, former British colonies. Each of them has an old colonial era British anti-homosexual criminal law. These are gone in the West. And so Southeast Asia becomes this curious museum of old colonial era criminal laws aimed at homosexuality.
Now that we're discussing about laws and sexuality, I wanted to focus more on the Sharia law that is being imposed in the region. Can you tell us more about it, Professor?
Islamic Sharia law in Southeast Asia deals mainly with family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, and also with Islamic charities. The only Sharia law that makes male-male sexual acts a crime in Southeast Asia at present is in Aceh, the small autonomous province in the north end of Sumatra in Indonesia. This law has been in effect for about 5 years now. The punishment is public caning, 100 strokes on the behind. There have been no accounts over this period of the imposition of the penalty, that is the prosecution of anybody for homosexual acts. The law applies to Muslims and non-Muslims. Otherwise, in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim majority country in the world, there is no criminal prohibition of homosexual acts.
Hello, my name is Ana Maria and I'm a master's degree student at Mahidol University of Human Rights. From the countries in Southeast Asia, 4 of them criminalize homosexuality. These countries are Brunei, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Singapore. Regarding the laws in the region against discrimination based on sexuality, Thailand is the only country that has adopted a Gender Equality Act in 2005. Yet, the Philippines is working on an anti-discrimination bill. Another aspect from sex and gender diversity to be mentioned is the banning of conversion therapy. A conversion therapy consists of a psychological treatment or spiritual counseling, which purpose is to change a person's sexual orientation from homosexual or bisexual to heterosexual. Regarding these conversion therapies, only 3 countries in the region have banned it. These are Vietnam, Indonesia, and Timor-Leste. Finally, from the 11 countries in the region, none of them legally recognize the same-sex marriage.
Now that we know more about the context of sexuality in Southeast Asia, I want to know, what does the international human rights have to say about this issue of SOGI and LGBT?
The first cases to raise in human rights terms the rights of LGBT internationally occurred in Europe. And they were challenges to British colonial era criminal prohibitions. The first cases involved the Republic of Ireland and Cyprus. So they were internal in Europe. And so the cases were heard by the European Court of Human Rights. The first case was decided in 1981. The European Court of Human Rights said homosexuals have a right of privacy, and that a criminal prohibition of consenting sexual activity between same-sex adults is an intrusion upon that right. At this point, many of the countries in Europe had decriminalized. And in fact, Britain had decriminalized in England, Wales, and Scotland. And so it was only Northern Ireland which was sort of standing out as a sore thumb that had retained the old law. So we were in a period of change, of substantive change. And it's very tempting to think that the United Kingdom wanted to lose the case to complete the decriminalization which had occurred in other parts of the United Kingdom. The result of these various processes have been that Europe has no prohibition at all at the present time. Even Eastern Europe decriminalized, as I think I mentioned, in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first case in the UN human rights system was Tunin versus Australia in 1994, interpreting the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's a kind of repeat of the 1981 Dudgeon case before the European Court of Human Rights, because Australia had decriminalized except for funny little Tasmania, the island. It's actually a very lovely place, but it had retained the old colonial era law. And so again, Australia really wanted to lose the case in the hopes of completing decriminalization in the country. And the UN decision of the Human Rights Committee was that we had a right of privacy, like the European decision, but also a right of equality. This was a discriminatory law, they held, picking out gay men and was struck down on the basis of its discriminatory character. In 2002, in the case of Goodwin versus the United Kingdom, the European Court of Human Rights, we got the first transgender ruling. So this is 20 years after the court starts rights of gay males. Now, finally, we get a positive decision in terms of transgender rights. Goodwin had undergone sex reassignment surgery and was seeking a change in personal documents. It was actually a marriage case. She wanted now to be confirmed as a woman for the purposes of getting married to a man. And the European Court of Human Rights, which had been troubled by, in previous decisions relating to transsexuals, finally says, yes, this is a right. And so she had a right to get her documents changed. The United Kingdom followed through with what was at the time very pioneering law recognizing transsexual rights. We've had subsequent cases as well at the European level, which have been very important. In terms of adoption rights, the court, again after being sort of troubled by the issue, comes through clearly saying that same-sex couples or same-sex or lesbian in the particular case must be treated on an equal basis with heterosexuals in the adoption law of any member state subject to the European Convention on Human Rights. Also, we get the beginnings of recognition of same-sex relationships. While the court says, no, we can't deliver marriage yet, they recognize a same-sex relationship for pension purposes in two cases. And we've had more recent cases pushing Italy to enact a registered partnership law to bring it more into line with European norms.
Professor, can you tell us more if there's any political opposition at the UN against sexuality?
Yes, the UN has been very, very divided on our issues. Opposition has come from three groupings of states within the UN system. Firstly, most of the sub-Saharan African countries have been opposed. Secondly, most of the member states of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation have been opposed. So in terms of Southeast Asia, that means Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei are against any movement on these issues. And thirdly, Russia and its close ally. While Eastern Europe decriminalized in the 1990s, more recently, Russia and the former satellites have introduced laws against any promotion of homosexuality, any propaganda, they say, in favor of homosexuality, which sort of means you're supposed to shut up and stay in the closet. But in 2011, for the first time, a majority of the Human Rights Council, and that's the central, preeminent political body for human rights in the UN system, the Human Rights Council recognized LGBTI rights and put the issues on the ongoing human rights agenda of the UN. Voting in favor were the Western group, that is Western Europe, North America, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and all of the states in Latin America were on side. Sometimes abstentions, sometimes positive votes from certain other countries. South Africa has been good and at times and reluctant at times. Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Philippines. You're never quite sure how some of these countries are going to vote. China used to be no, and then it would abstain, and then most recently it said no again. It's hard to predict these votes. But we've now had 3 resolutions of the Human Rights Council supporting LGBTI rights. And the most important one, of course, is the most recent one. In 2016, the Council authorized the appointment of an independent expert to deal with issues of violence and discrimination on SOGI grounds. Each of these 3 resolutions has been a small majority, and in the appointment of the independent expert, there was a fight in the Council, of course, and there was 2 fights in the General Assembly, which had to approve this. The expert has been appointed, Professor Vitit Munterborn from Thailand. He started his work in March of 2017 with a visit to Argentina. Argentina had been a pioneer. It was the pioneer of same-sex marriage in Latin America, and it passed a wide-open self-determination gender identity law, which was a leading example of how this should be handled in the world.
Professor, is there some acceptance of SOGI in Southeast Asia?
The situation in this region is really very mixed. We've already referred to the fact that there are 4 countries which have criminal prohibitions from British colonial times. But these prohibitions are very, very rarely enforced. In fact, Singapore has committed itself to no active enforcement of its provision, being maybe the only country to actually say we aren't going to enforce as a routine strategy of police action. In the region, a distinctive character of a major part of the region is the existence of third sex or transgender population groups, identified groupings. 5 countries: Waria in Indonesia, Maknaya in Malaysia, Katoi in Thailand, Open in Myanmar, and Bakla in the Philippines. These are very local, very indigenous groupings, not Western influenced at all. But they tend to be seen as quite separate from categories of gay and lesbian individuals. Day to day here in Thailand, where I live, I see trans women as clerks in shops, as waitresses, owning small businesses, running beauty parlors. And so there's a high visibility of these categories. And increasingly, trans men have become more visible in the region. And that's something that's really only the sort of last 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. Most gay men and lesbian women in the region stay in the closet, as we say. They do not disclose their sexual orientation to their workmates or if they're in school, to other classmates. So they wind up being very isolated. That is gradually changing as people become more familiar with sex and gender diversity. For the first time, we have a trans woman elected to Congress in the Philippines. It's the first in the region.
So, Professor, has there been any changes in terms of the law or society in the region?
Yes, there have been positive changes. Thailand now has a Gender Equality Act brought in by the military government. Mm-hmm. They didn't actually draft it, they inherited it from the previous civilian government, but they actually enacted it. Thailand may get a Gender Recognition Act. The drafting of that has just started, so we can't hold our breath on that one. It'll be at least 2 years, I think, before we see a draft. And there's already controversy about they're following a very old-fashioned model on gender recognition. If we got that, we would be joining Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam to make 4 countries in the Southeast Asia region in which document change is possible, but the conditions in these countries at the moment is really quite restrictive. The Philippines is very interesting because there are now about 8 or more local laws in provinces or cities in the Philippines prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. These were pioneered in Quezon City, which is, of course, the home of the University of the Philippines' main campus. Campaigners have been trying to get a national anti-discrimination law for a long time, but the success has been happening at the local level. There is a very well-established Q film festival in Indonesia and smaller LGBTI film festivals in Bangkok, Manila, and Yangon. Mm-hmm. So some things are happening. Bullying in schools is a major issue in the region and in the world, and it is, to a fair extent, a reflection of greater visibility of lesbians and gays and transgendered individuals. More talk about the issue has had, in the short run, some very negative consequences for students. Hostility or a lack of acceptance within the birth family of LGBTI is over and over again cited as the #1 problem for LGBT youth in the region and in a recent study released on discrimination in China. But in major parts of the region, there have been incremental steps forward and a somewhat friendlier atmosphere. So change is underway, sometimes frustratingly slow, and sometimes with at least short-term reversals.